Hi everyone, and welcome to the next chapter from Nimzowicz's My System. This time we'll look at the isolated queen's pawn and its descendants. We'll also delve a little into the theory beyond the bishop pair, as Nimzowitsch understood it, which is interesting as it's slightly contrary to modern ideas. So to start off with the isolated queen's pawn, we can take a look at this position. We're just entering the middle game, and as we can see, White has an isolated queen's pawn here on d4, i.e. a pawn on the d-file that does not have any neighboring pawns. Generally speaking, this can be both a strength and a weakness, and we'll have a look at why both of these cases can be true as we progress through the chapter. In Nimzowicz's opinion, the issue of the isolated queen's pawn, or IQP, was one of the cardinal problems of positional play. Often it can represent a static weakness, but at the same time it's also full of dynamic strength. So which of these factors is more important, the weakness or the strength? Essentially, there is no straightforward answer to this, and Nimzowitsch felt that it was a matter of personal preference. His advice was to play out the following position with a partner of equal strength. If we go from the opening, d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, e3, c5, knight c3, knight c6, and try, first of all, bishop d3, and c takes d4, e takes d4, d takes c4, and bishop takes c4, allowing black to inflict an isolated pawn on white. So this is a great position to try against someone who's approximately equal strength. Obviously both have a go at playing white, and then after you've tried this, instead of bishop d3, play c takes d5, e takes d5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, inflicting an isolated pawn on black and playing against it. And his feeling was that playing out both sides should give an excellent feel to how dangerous an isolated pawn, such as the one here on d5, can become in the middle game. Also, however, it should reveal how difficult it is to defend such a pawn in the endgame, if indeed the endgame is reached in your practice games. Another thing that should always be kept in mind is that in IQP positions, the side playing against the isolated pawn has blockading ideas and an outpost square directly in front of the pawn. Here on d4 for white. So if white's going to set up a blockade, he's going to plant a piece here on d4. And the side playing with the isolated queen's pawn has outpost squares that are protected by the pawn. In this position, c4 and e4 for black. So he's going to move pieces down to c4 and e4, and as well as that, black also has excuse me, two open files to work with, which should provide active play for his middle game. And Nimzowitsch felt again that there was no better teacher than personal experience for understanding these positions optimally, but he was more than happy to share the fruits of his years of research and experience with such positions himself. So if we return again to the first position, as far as the strengths are concerned in this pawn for white, there are several ideas at work. This pawn here on d4. The tendency is for the pawn to explore its lust to expand through advancing to d5, which can activate the very active play for white. Another of its strengths lie in the fact that it's supporting white's outpost squares on e5 and c5, although c5 isn't an outpost here because black has played b6, but this is something of a positional concession anyway. So black has the d5 square for his pieces, but at least for the middle game, this is not full compensation for white's positional pluses. Usually, as I said, white will have the c5 and e5 squares and as outposts, which makes two outposts against one, so that's, you know, twice as many. And on top of that, it's often possible for white to demonstrate that his outposts are stronger than black's. For example, here if white plays knight e5 and black answers knight bd5, white can play bishop d3 and then bishop g5 next with all manner of tactical pressure and ideas. So this puts the black king in a spotlight, this move bishop d3, and in Nimzowicz's words, what is more urgent than an attack on one's king? His conviction was that an exploration of these lines will clearly illustrate an underlying advantage for white. However, should black manage to steer the game into an endgame position, it will become clear that white's isolated pawn has a tendency towards weakness. So, what makes up this weakness? It's not simply that the pawn is more difficult than normal to defend. Other positional factors play a strong role too. For example, we can see here that the pawn structure is almost identical as in the previous position, but we're in an endgame. For the moment, the white king has the opposition and is stopping the black king getting to d5, which would be a serious nuisance. But black can play simply knight c8, deliver a check on the next move, and then get his king to d5 on the move after that. Subsequently, he'll be able to move his king to e4 or c4 and penetrate further into the white position. In any case, d5 is the key square for black. He can use it to blockade, centralize, and maneuver. It functions as a gateway and also as a key square for all pieces to pivot on to gain access to other squares. If we still had rooks in play here, for example one on d8, then there would be ideas like rook d5 to a5, or if the knight was on f6, then knight d5 b4, or knight d5 e7 f5, and taking on d4 in conjunction with the king. And a knight on d5 in such positions has a great sphere of influence on both sides of the board. A bishop on d5 would be even more decisive. However, there are other factors to consider as well. For example, if white had penetrated with a rook to c7, then it might be a different story, but this would be an exception to the rule. So to summarize, white's endgame weakness is the fact that the d4 pawn is weak, in conjunction with the fact that the d5 square is strong for black. Moreover, the c4 and e4 squares are also weak for white, and his previous strength, the e5 outpost, has lost most of its former significance. Nimzowitsch closes this section by again stressing that it's not the isolated pawn on its own that's weak, but the squares around it, which constitute the most serious problem. Another point here is that white's pawns are not compact, and this is often the cause of a weakness on a particular color of square, in this case the light squares for white, c4 and e4. Nimzowitsch advises us as students to try and pay close attention to what represents compact and non-compact positions. Usually it has to do with the pawn structure, especially if it is damaged or if there are isolated pawns, as in this example. Okay, so now we'll look at the idea of the isolated pawn, or isolani, as an instrument of an attack in the middle game. First, it bears well to remember that with sound development, we should be able to maintain pressure and give way to an attack at the first sign of weakness from our opponent. However, and that said, many amateurs rush forwards too quickly when an isolated pawn is involved, and in Nimzowicz's opinion, there is no justification for such an approach. Rather, the more appropriate buzzword is stability before anything else. The attack will come of its own accord once we develop properly and our opponent makes an oversight. For example, through moving his kingside knight away from f6 at the wrong moment. In many cases he'll want to play knight d5 in order to create a blockade, so that's one instance where he could move it at the wrong moment. Nimzowitsch recommends playing bishop e3 to support d4 instead of bishop g5, with rooks on c1 and d1, not normally on e1, the queen on c2, the light square bishop on d3 or b1, but not b3. And he also warns explicitly against surprise early sacrifices, such as knight takes f7, or anti-positional rook lifts, such as getting a rook to h3 via the third rank. It is an attacking idea, but just not to do it too early, and not until the position is clear and everything is properly understood. In his opinion, the only correct square to play the dark square bishop is d4. The bishop e3 is the main source of its protection, and the main problem for white is how to defend his d4 pawn. He has to take care of that before he tries to do anything else. So therefore, bishop e3 makes the most sense, and this is the main source of the pawn's protection. It's like a nurse minding a baby in Nimzowicz's view, and only when black removes pieces from the king's side is it right for white to start an attack. For an example, in this position, which Nimzowitsch reached with white against Taubenhaus at a tournament in St. Petersburg in 1913, his opponent continued with knight takes e3. But let's say that he played instead knight e8. Now white can continue with queen h5, threatening mate on h7. So g6, queen h6, and knight g7. If instead f6, knight g4 is strong. So knight g7, and now bishop g5, and suddenly the white pieces are springing to life. So f6, bishop takes g6, very strong sacrifice. Forces h takes g6, and now knight takes g6, attacking the queen. And there are two lines depending on where black moves the queen. For example, queen d7 is one of the moves. So the other main one is queen d6. So white can play bishop h4 now, but there's also a more aggressive line. He can play bishop takes f6 here, giving up another piece. So knight takes f6, queen h8 check, king f7, knight e5 check, winning the queen. King e8, knight takes d7, rook takes h8, knight takes f6 check, and now he has 3 pawns for the piece and good chances in the endgame. So that's if black plays queen d7 at this moment. If he plays queen d6, then queen h8 check, king f7, queen h7, and if f takes g5, knight e5 check, king e8, queen takes g7, queen e7, queen g6 check, king d8, and now rook c6, exploiting the tactical situation. And this time he has 2 pawns for the piece, but huge pressure and complications. So we see some of the attacking lines that can emerge if black loses his attention for a moment. But to summarize the essential rules again: develop solidly, support the isolated pawn, and attack only when it is sound to do so. There's a further point to be made in relation to the isolated queen's pawn positions. There's also the possibility of related weaknesses emerging. This is an indication of the weakness of the isolated queen's pawn itself, that the attacking side can frequently transfer his attack from the isolated pawn to the queen side. The following game is such an example. It's played between Rubinstein with white and Lasker in Moscow in 1925. So d4, d5, c4, c6, the Slav, and we won't give too much attention to the opening until we get to the position we want to talk about. This is still a reasonably popular line, although b3 and bishop b2 isn't so common nowadays. You can see white's centralizing, and now we have the creation of the isolated pawn. So rook c8, g3, queen a8, intensifying the pressure on the knight. Both pairs of rooks come off. Now h6 from Lasker, and from here followed a strategically interesting exploitation of the weakness of the d4 pawn from Lasker. So bishop b2, knight b6, now h3. Rubinstein wants to avoid the exchange of queens here. He can play queen c2 because he has to retain the defense of the knight. But then queen c8 is good for black. So queen c8 was played anyway. Queen d3, knight d5, threatening knight b4 with some headaches for white. So a3, knight b6, because b3 has suddenly become weak, and this is the creation of the weakness that the isolated pawn resulted in, this weakening of the queenside pawns. So king h2, bishop d5, king g2, the queen's protecting it for now. So queen c6, knight d2, now a5. Just very nice idea to play a4 here. So queen c3. Now in desperation, Rubinstein offers the exchange of queens himself, but this succumbs to the related weakness that's just emerged. Bishop takes f3, knight takes f3 is forced. If queen takes f3, queen c2 is strong. Queen b7, knight d5 is looking good for black. So knight takes f3, now queen takes c3, b takes c3, and a4. And the weakness of white's queenside pawns becomes apparent. B takes a4, b takes a4, and this is excuse me, an incredibly tough endgame for white to hold. Even the virtuoso endgame player Rubinstein was not able to manage it. He played king f1, simply allowing the pawn to drop here on a3, and he was ground down in about 20 moves. The point is that white simply cannot hold on to the pawn. If bishop b2, then knight c4, and if bishop b4, bishop takes b4, a takes b4, a3, knight d2, knight d5 is winning, because it prevents the white king from coming to the rescue via e2, d3 and c4. King e2 will always be met with knight c3 check, and then pushing the pawn because it's defending b2, and white will have to give up the knight in order to avoid having to face a queen. So obviously that's just completely lost. So it was an excellent endgame from Lasker, an instructive example of transferring the attack to the queen side, and also a masterly display of the use of the blockading square on d5. It's also important to note that it's not always necessary to completely immobilize the isolated pawn. Sometimes it's worthwhile giving it at least the illusion of some freedom of movement. The next game we'll see is a good example of such a case. This was played again by Lasker with white against Turash in 1914. Lasker opened with d4, then came d5, knight f3, c5, c4, e6, cd, ed. So the creation of the isolated pawn on d5. g3, knight c6, bishop g2, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, knight b d2, and now d4. Turash advances the pawn immediately, which is double-edged. Okay, it puts some positional pressure on white, i.e. he cannot advance his e-pawn immediately without creating a weakness, but it also makes the isolated pawn harder to defend, and Lasker plays instructively with that fact in mind. So knight b3, bishop b6, queen d3, bishop e6, increasing the pressure on d4. Sorry, trying to relieve the pressure on d4. because he knows this move is coming. So bishop takes b3 is forced in order to keep the pawn. Queen takes b3, queen e7, bishop d2, castles. Now a4 and knight e4. Queen takes e2 runs into trouble after rook e1. Queen a6 is forced if black wants to keep the queen, and now bishop f1, and it's trapped. So knight e4, bishop e1, rook a d8, now a5. It's a great move from Lasker that really pushes black to the limit with regard to defending his d4 pawn. So bishop c5, now a6, another very nice move. B takes a6 was played. If instead b6, queen a4, attacking the knight, and b4 is coming next, and that's going to win the d4 pawn. So b takes a6, and what's the point of Lasker's play? Rook ac1 is the point, and black is under huge pressure. The pieces protecting the d4 pawn are hanging by a thread on the c file. And playing rook c8, which is Tarash's move, is a blunder that loses the exchange. Knight h4, and the queen has to remain defending the knights, and knight f5 is coming, and yeah, the knight is supporting the bishop, so the problem is exchanging on e4 and then taking on c5. So bishop b6, now knight f5, queen has to stay defending the knight, so queen e5, bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, and knight d6 wins the exchange, and Lasker went on to win without much difficulty. So it's a very nice, smoothly played game, and very instructive and nice. Okay, so now we can consider the isolated pawn as an endgame weakness. So here it's black to move. How do you think he should continue? If you want to think about it for a moment, then stop the video now. Knight takes c3 is a playable move here, but it takes careful consideration. If it's possible to stop the pawns on c3 and d4 through setting up a blockade, then this unusual choice of move, because it relieves white of his isolated pawn, and it means the black doesn't have this good outpost anymore. It can be considered playable. After b takes c3, white has to concern himself with defending these weak pawns, and Nimzowitsch called these two pawns here, when they're set up like this, the isolated pawn pair, when they occur on c3 and d4, or c6 and d5 if it's black. Of course, should white manage to advance the c3 pawn to c4, his pawns are no longer the isolated pawn pair, but they become instead hanging pawns, which we'll get to shortly, and they're much more preferable to the isolated pawn pair, as they at least threaten some kind of initiative while simultaneously being weak, whereas the isolated pawn pair merely radiate a passive weakness. In a position such as this, even with many more pieces on the board, white should do everything he can in order to advance his c3 pawn to c4 as a matter of highest priority, and ensure that his opponent cannot set up a blockade, which would be very strong. The structure with pawns on c3 and d4 should be considered a transitory grub-like state on the path to metamorphosis into the butterfly of hanging pawns, which will always contain the threat of advancing with either c5 or d5. So now let's look at a game that features such a struggle. So this was played by Nimzowitsch with white against two men playing together against him. Their names were Geersing and Kinch in Copenhagen in 1926. Nimzowitsch opened with c4, then came e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, ed, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight takes c6, b takes c6, g3, d5, bishop g2, bishop b4 check, bishop d2, bishop takes, knight takes, castles, castles, rook b8, queen c2. And this is an important moment actually. It's relevant to note that white wants to avoid playing b3 in order to deal with this b file pressure, because the b3 square is going to be an important maneuvering point for his pieces, as will become clear. So queen c2 to defend b2. Rook e8, now e3, bishop e6, c takes d, c takes d, and now black has the isolated pawn pair, although his pawn is on c7 as opposed to c6. So now comes knight b3, which is prophylaxis against black playing the desired move c5. So queen d6, rook fc1, again to stop c5, rook ec8, now queen c5. Queen takes, rook takes, and you know, black's play is easy to understand once the positional components of it are clear. So knight d7, now rook a5. Black is just one move from playing c5, but this this move, rook a5, threatens his a pawn, and so what should he do about that? If he does nothing, then rook ac1 is coming, and he'll never get to play c5. So c5 was played by Nimzowicz's two opponents, sacking a pawn to put an end to the positional woes. And this is definitely the correct way to play. After rook a7, c4, knight d4, rook takes b2, we see that it's only a temporary sacrifice, and black is not worried about knight takes f6, f takes e6, rook takes d7, giving up an entire piece, because the pawn mobility here creates huge threats. c3, and there's no way for white to force a win. So excellent judgment on the part of Nimzowicz's opponents. Bishop a3, c2, bishop takes e6 check, king f8, rook f8 check, king e8, bishop takes c8, rook b1 check, king g2, rook takes a1. If instead c1 queen, rook takes, queen takes, and rook f4 keeps the balance, and maybe even white is better here. So rook a1, rook c7, c1 queen, rook takes c1, rook takes c1. And with two pawns for the exchange, Nimzowitsch was able to draw this endgame about 12 moves later. So that was an instructive example of some of the possibilities of positions that feature the isolated pawns pair, and the difficulties that white can create in preventing the advance for black, or you know, that the player playing against the isolated pawn pair can create for his opponent. Okay, so now we'll move on to the idea of hanging pawns. We've looked at the end game of the game we'll look at here before in an earlier video. It was played between Rubinstein with white and Nimzowitsch in Carlsbad in 1907. It's important for what we'll discuss because we can see a progression in it from black having an isolated pawn to the isolated pawn pair, and finally to the hanging pawns. So that's, you know, the idea of the isolated queen's pawn and its descendants, which are the isolated pawn pair and then the hanging pawns. So we can see these three ideas or positional factors at these stages of the game. So e takes d5, the isolated pawn is created. Okay, and play continues like this: cd, knight d, bishop b4, and so on. So after knight takes c6, b takes c6, now we have the isolated pawn pair on c6 and d5. Okay, so play continues. Now we have the creation of the hanging pawns. So from this progression, it should be clear that the ancestors of the hanging pawns were first of all the isolated pawn and then the isolated pawn pair. This is usually, but not always, the case, and it's a useful parallel to bear in mind their familial relationship, as they feature some similar characteristics that one might expect to see in any other family. In Nimzowicz's words, the unclear motives of the hanging pawns are a direct contrast to the clarity of the isolated pawn. But the thing they share in common is their propensity for both static weakness and aggressive power. The themes and motives regarding both the strengths of isolated pawns, the fact that they support strong outpost squares and threaten to advance at any moment as strengths, but also that they are weak in the endgame, that they are in constant need of protection, and the squares close to them can also become weak, are absolutely clear and evident. With hanging pawns, such things are hidden, as opposed to with the isolated queen's pawns. So with hanging pawns, these things are hidden and mostly uncertain, and depend on various other factors in the position. In Nimzowicz's view, only two things can be considered as solidly established about hanging pawns. The fact that the pawns are not protected by other pawns makes them liable to attack, and gives the attacking player chances to open files as a result. And secondly, that reaching a relatively safe position where one of the pawns has advanced, in this case it would have to be a c4 push, but in other positions it could also be d4. This happens a lot of the time. The issue, however, is that advancing the pawns to achieve this said stability releases any chance for initiative in the center and makes them all the easier to blockade, and thus we're posed with the consideration that perhaps it's best to keep the pawns hanging, i.e. side by side as they are here, for as long as possible. The truths within such a proposition are not easy to glean. Ultimately, it depends on the particulars of the position in question and the type of blockade the pawns will be faced with. Oftentimes, they will still be liable to attack, and so it is a difficult decision to make. Despite that, it's still sometimes advisable to advance hanging pawns, especially if the position is blocked. There are also other things to consider. For example, if the pawns involved on the blockading side are also liable to be attacked, as in the case here. In this game, in fact, Nimzowitsch was able to create play against the b2 pawn. Another factor is how much setting up a blockade will restrict the blockading player's freedom of movement, and how effective his pieces will be from their blockading posts. Something that must always be considered in setting up a blockade. Also, if the advanced passed pawns create some kind of positional grip or contribute to some pressure, then their advance is more justified. This game continued rook c1, bishop e6, queen a4, queen b6. Black is retaining the hanging pawn formation for as long as possible. Queen a3 to defend b2. Now c4. Black is taking solace in the fact that he has some security and solidity and only has to worry about defending one weak pawn now, here on d5. Additionally, he can build up pressure against b2, so this advance is further justified because it makes white advance into b3 to relieve that pressure not possible. So play continued, bishop e2, now a5, rook fd1, queen b4, rook d4, rook fd8, rook dc1, rook d7, bishop f3, rook a d8. Of course, it's clear that the whole position here is about the d5 pawn. Now, however, Rubinstein went slightly awry. He should play a waiting move, such as rook d2, but he played knight b1, and this allowed Nimzowitsch to take the initiative. So rook b8, rook 1 d2, queen takes a3, knight takes a3, king f8. Now e4. This leads to the loss of a pawn, but white's position was starting to become unfavorable in any case. Black's weak d5 pawn was counterbalanced by the weak b2 pawn, but Rubinstein's retreating of the knight has meant that b2 has become even weaker, whilst d5 has become a point of overprotection for Nimzowitsch. that he does not need to worry about so much. So d takes e4, rook takes, knight takes, bishop takes, now knight c5, rook d4, knight takes e4, rook takes c4, rook takes b2, knight c4, rook b4, knight d6 is forced, rook takes, knight takes, and now bishop takes a2. And we now have the endgame that we explored at an earlier stage of the book, in the previous chapter I think it was. Nimzowitsch went on to win from this position, a very nice endgame. So in this game we saw the c-pawn of the hanging pair advance. More often, however, it's the d-pawn, and this often leads to the position back to one of an isolated pawn again. In a rather neat circle, we go from isolated pawn to the hanging pawn pair, the isolated pawn pair, and then the hanging pawns, and then back to the isolated pawn again. And what will matter once the second isolated pawn is created is whether the new isolated pawn can prove its worth in the resultant position. So we can have a look at a game that features that. Now, this time Nimzowitsch had white, and he was playing against Tartakower in Copenhagen in 1923. He opened with knight f3, then came d5, b3, c5, e3, knight c6, bishop b2. This is sometimes known as the Nimzo-Larsen attack, because Nimzowitsch was fond of playing this bishop b2 and knight f3 system for a while, as was Larsen. Bishop g4, bishop e2, queen c7, d4, cd, ed, e6, castles, bishop d6, h3, bishop takes, knight f6, now c4, dc, bc. White now has the hanging pawns. So castles, now knight c3. Often it's best to play knight d2 to b3 with the hanging pawns in order to support d4 and keep them hanging for as long as possible. But Nimzowitsch wanted to create play as soon as possible in this position, saying that the position was ripe for it. So rook f8, knight b5, queen e7, queen e2, bishop b8, now d5. The advance of the hanging pawns, this time the d pawn. And the result of this will damage black's structure and create a pass pawn for white. See how the advance of the hanging pawns unleash this bishop on the black king side. So ed5, queen e7, knight e7, bishop f6, gf6, cd5. And now again we have the isolated queen's pawn position. So bishop e5, knight takes d5 runs into big problems after rook d1. So bishop e5, and now rook a d1. And from here Nimzowitsch managed to maintain the pass pawn, which proved to be more significant than black's queenside majority, and white went on to win. So another nice positional display from Nimzowitsch. So now let's look at an example where the hanging pawns proved to be a weakness as opposed to a strength. We'll get to that in part 2.